My dear students in the 4th grade, today we will discuss chapter 4 in marketing research course about the exploratory research design and the secondary data. We will divide this chapter for part 1 and part 2. In this lecture, we will discuss part 1 of chapter 4. The secondary data analysis of reputable studies in a cost-effective way to provide useful context dimensionally and insight into the formulation of exploration of a research problem. After reading this chapter, the student should be able to define the nature and the scope of the secondary data and distinguish secondary data from primary data, analyze the advantage and disadvantage of the secondary data and their uses in the various steps of marketing research process, evaluate data using specification, errors, currency, objectives, nature, and dependability criteria. Describe in detail the different sources of secondary data, including internal sources and external sources in the form of published materials. Discuss in details the syndicated sources of secondary data. Including household consumer data obtained via surveys, purchase and media panels. Explain the need to use the multiple sources of secondary data and describe single source data. Then discuss some applications of secondary data in computer mapping and identify and evaluate the sources of secondary data useful in the international marketing. This concept map is for the secondary data to show the position of the secondary data in the marketing research map. In the third step, we have the research design. The research design involves the secondary data and primary data. The secondary data have two classification, may be internal or external, as we will show in this chapter. In this chapter, we will differentiate between primary data and the secondary data. The primary data are originated by a researcher for the specific purpose of addressing the problem at hand. The collection of primary data involves all 6 steps of the marketing research process, and we discuss the primary data in chapter 1. The secondary data are data which have been collected for purposes other than the problem at hand. This data can be located quickly and inexpensively. In this table, it's a comparison of primary and secondary data. The first item of this comparison is the collection purpose for the primary data for the problem at hand. For other problems, for collection process, the primary data is very involved, and the secondary data is easy and rapid. in the collection cost, the primary data have a high cost, but the secondary data has relatively low cost. The collection time of primary data always is long, but the secondary data has a short collection time. There are some advantages and uses of the secondary data. The secondary data is important in identifying the problem and better define the problem, develop an approach to the problem. The secondary data help to formulate an appropriate research design, for example, by identifying the key variables, answer certain research questions, and test some hypotheses. And the secondary data are easy, accessible, relatively inexpensive, and quickly obtained. All these points are advantage for the secondary data. The secondary data have some disadvantage point also. The secondary data objectives, nature, and methods used to collect the secondary data may not be appropriate to the present situation, and the secondary data may be lacking in accuracy, time and accessibility, dependability, or they may not be complete, current or available or dependable. All these points are disadvantage for the secondary data. When the researcher collects the secondary data may be a lot of data and many tables of data, but the researcher should evaluate these secondary data. There are some criteria for evaluating the secondary data. The first criteria is specification, methodology used to collect the data. Error is the accuracy of the data, currency when the data were collected, and objectives, the purpose for which the data were collected. The criteria of nature include the content of data and the dependability criteria. Overall, how dependable are these data? This table explain each point of criteria and how what's its issues and the remarks for every criteria in the evaluating the secondary data. In the first criteria of specification, the researcher should evaluate some specifications like the data collection response date, quality of data, sampling techniques, sample size. All these issues can be evaluated by the researcher. The error, examine the errors in the approach, research design, sampling, data collection. All these items can be or can involve some errors, so the researcher should examine these errors. The currency included the time lag between collection and publication. It may be some time between the collection of data and the publication of these data, so the researcher should revise all these data. The criteria for evaluating the secondary data also include the objective, why were the data collected, and the objective will determine the relevance data, the nature of these data, definition of key variables, units of measurement, categories used, relationships examined, and the dependability, the expertise, credibility, reputation, and trustworthy lines of the sources. The secondary data has two main classification. The two main classification is the internal secondary data and the external secondary data. We can collect the internal secondary data from some sources like the internal data published inside the organization. These internal data may be ready to use or required further processing. And the external secondary data, we can collect it from the published materials, computerized database, syndicated services. In this slide, we differentiate between the internal secondary data and the external secondary data. The internal secondary data is the internal data or data available within the organization for which the research is being conducted, such as information routinely supplied by the management decision support system. So the internal data is all the information collected inside the organization and are being on the marketing information system or the MIS unit in the organization. But the external data are those generated by sources outside the organization. There are many sources outside the organization can collect the external data or the external secondary data from these sources. This data may exist in the form of published materials, computerized database. It may be offline or online, or from the internet, or from some syndicated firms outside the organization. The internal secondary data, we can collect it from maybe from data mining, from customer relationship management, from database marketing. Here we have some examples of the internal secondary data, like the information in the department store project, like some sales were analyzed to obtain, like the sales by the product line, sales by the major department, sales by specific stores, sales by geographical region, sales by cash versus credit purchases, sales in specific time periods, sales by size of purchase, sales trends. In many of these classifications were also examined. So all these types of sales are involved in the classification of the internal secondary data. There are some type of individual or households level data available from the syndicated firms. The syndicated firms are firms introduces some services or data collection services for the firms to collect some data about the consumers, competitors, suppliers, distributors. It collect and gathered all these data in the industry or the marketplace that the firm work in it, and can introduce this data or this secondary data for the firms, like the demographic data about the consumers, like the identification, sex, material status, names of family members, age, income, occupation. All these secondary data can be introduced by the syndicated firms. In this slide also some example for the secondary data or external secondary data introduced by the syndicated firms, like the physiological lifestyle data, psychographic lifestyle data. These psychographic lifestyle data about the consumers, like what the consumer interest in sporting, in these life, like the interest in golf, interest in snow skiing, interest in book reading, interest in running. There are also firms such as Dun and Bradstreet and American Business Information collect these demographic data or these psychographic lifestyle data about the consumer and introduce the data for the firms that need these external secondary data. In this point, we are in the end point of part 1 of chapter 4, and we will discuss the remain of chapter 4 in the next lecture. So thank you, my dear students, and goodbye.